So from the text, you know that we're doing something a little bit different. We're taking a break from 1 Peter. I'm not particularly good at doing different things. If you notice in front, that's my car right there. It's a 2015 Scion XB. My previous two cars were 2013 Scion XB and a 2010 Scion XB. But I thought it would be profitable for us to do somewhat of a topical sermon today. So the first portion of this is just going to be a Bible reading through the whole chapter. So bear with me as I read again Matthew chapter 2 in its entirety. Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east and have come to worship him. When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And when he had gathered all the chief priests and scribes of the people together, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. So they said to him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for thus it is written by the prophet, but you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are not the least among the rulers of Judah. For out of you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. Then Herod, when he had secretly called the wise men, determined from them what time the star appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, go and search carefully for the young child. And when you have found him, bring back word to me that I may come and worship him also. When they heard the king, they departed, and behold, the star which they had seen in the east went before them till it came and stood over where the child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceedingly great joy. And when they had come into the house, they saw the young child with Mary his mother, and fell down and worshipped him. And when they had opened their treasures, they presented gifts to him, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Then being divinely warned in a dream that they should not return to Herod, they departed for their own country another way. Verse 13. Now when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream, saying, arise, take the young child and his mother, flee to Egypt, and stay there until I bring you word, for Herod will seek the young child to destroy him. When he arose, he took the young child and his mother by night and departed to Egypt, and was there until the death of Herod, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the Lord through the prophet, saying, out of Egypt I called my son. Then Herod, when he saw he was deceived by the wise men, was exceedingly angry, and he sent forth and put to death all the male children who were in Bethlehem and in all its districts from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had determined from the wise men. Then was fulfilled which was spoken by Jeremiah the prophet, saying, a voice was heard in Ramah, lamenting, weeping, and great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children, refusing to be comforted, because they are no more. Now when Herod was dead, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, saying, arise, take the young child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, for those who sought the young child's life are dead. Then he arose, took the young child and his mother, and came into the land of Israel. But when he heard the Archelaus was reigning over Judea instead of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there, and being warned by God in a dream, he turned aside into the region of Galilee. And he came and dwelt in a city called Nazareth, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the prophets, he shall be a Nazarene. The title of the message today is The Three Kings. And usually I don't refer to the titles of my messages because, frankly, I don't put a lot of thought into them. Mostly, you could entitle all of my messages, Whatever is Next. Part 1, 2, 365. But here, again, because we are doing a topical sermon, I had to put a little bit more thought into my title, The Three Kings. And superficially, if you were to think about the content of the sermon prior to me giving it, obviously, you would think that this sermon has to do with the three wise men. We just read the story that they were included. We know from more of a Catholic, extra-biblical perspective, sometimes they are called the three kings, and they even have names, which I don't recall, but I'm sure some of you have heard that before. But no, our focus will not be on the three wise men. We will focus on the three kings and rulers that are named here, one at a time, and then do somewhat of a comparison and contrast with the information that I cover. Also, we will utilize a lot of extra biblical accounts as well. Again, something different, but I thought it was profitable for this type of message. And you will see that it's more of a biographical sketch of sorts, as opposed to just the normal type of sermons that we do usually on a weekly basis. So let's cover the first king that is mentioned here in this section of Matthew. The first king is right in the beginning. In the first verse, it says, "Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king." This is in fact Herod the Great. And Herod the Great, he was pretty much the king of Judea, the state of the Jewish people in this day and age, and he was known as a client king. What is a client king? A client king, in other words, is a puppet king. We know that Rome and the Caesar Augustus, they were the ones that were really in charge, and they had this policy every once in a while. They would allow a local or regional ruler to be called king, and the authority that he had was based on whatever they allowed. So Herod was a king, but did not have autonomy. He had to rule in accordance to Roman's will and the emperor's will. So whatever he did or did not do had to be filtered through those means. He reigned for about 35 years, and as you would expect, being a puppet king, he was rather insecure about his position. Again, he was a king, but not like many other kings who can do whatever they want and establish their own will upon his peoples. He had to always go through Rome, and whatever authority that he had could be taken away at any given time, even though he lasted a very long time. But again, those 3+ decades must have been anxiety-filled, never knowing if he would continue as king or if he would be replaced by the Caesar. Also, something important to take note is his heritage. Herod the Great was an Edomite. He was a descendant of Esau. Why is this important? Just think about the history and the story of Esau. Esau was the firstborn of his family. Even though he had a twin brother, he came out first. So because of that, he had the right to be blessed as the firstborn child. And we all know the story of when his brother, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, his brother, utilizing a little bit of help from his mother, tricked their father into giving Jacob the blessing of the firstborn child. His mother cooked up a stew. He put on a furry coat. And prior to his father's death, they had a little dialogue. And his father wasn't quite sure if he was, in fact, Esau, his favorite son. But then he ate the meal and kind of touched his furry coat and said, yeah, you must be my eldest son, and went ahead and blessed him. So again, you put all these things together, put both of these variables together, and you can come up with this biographical sketch of a king who was very fearful about his position, the security of his reign, not knowing if he was going to be replaced or not knowing if he was going to be tricked out of his position. And then we have this story, the story of the wise men who came looking for the Messiah. Somehow they knew about the stories and the prophecies, and they saw the star, and they went into this particular location, and they inquired the person who should have known who and where he was. Now, when Herod heard that the king of the Jews was to be born, he was very fearful, again, did not want to be replaced. We have the remaining part of the story where eventually the wise men go and find Jesus, but were warned not to return the same way and not go to Herod because of Herod's intentions. When Herod found out about their trickery, remember the heritage, he was furious. He was filled with anxiety. Can this happen again? Am I going to be replaced? Is this the fate that I will have to bear? So then he did a horrible thing. He went ahead and decreed that all of these children, more or less the age of what Jesus could have or should have been in this particular region of Bethlehem and the surrounding district, that they should be executed. What a horrible thing to do. And oftentimes we think of Herod the Great as just this horrible person who liked killing babies, but mostly his actions were not just of a tyrant who wanted to slaughter innocent kids. It was an action of someone who was very insecure, who was very fearful, who did not want to be replaced, and had a lot of paranoia about his position. As we know, Herod the Great eventually died. We have it listed here. The family went to Egypt. They stayed there for a while, and then they returned to their homeland after Herod the Great died. I think that is in verse 19. Now, when Herod was dead, it says that on verse 19, and historians, they make account and they describe and document the way in which Herod the Great died. He acquired an illness right after, a few months after these events of the decree to slaughter the babies. He acquired this illness, which was a horrible illness with horrible effects. The historian Josephus, who was a very renowned, reputable historian in the first century, says this, and I'm going to just kind of read this more or less verbatim, but pay attention to what he was dealing with. A burning fever seized him with an intolerable itching all over his body and continual stomach pains. His feet swelled. He had an inflammation in the lower part of his belly. decay in his private parts, which bred worms, difficulty breathing, convulsions in all of his members. He had a ferocious appetite, a stinking breath, and his intestines abounded with ulcers. Again, just a few months after his decree and the death of these innocent children, this is what happened to Herod the Great. And also, when Herod lost all hope, when he knew that there was no medicine, no remedy for his state, and he was tired of suffering, he tried to take his own life. However, he was impeded to do so by his own subjects, and eventually died a horrible death. This is the story of the first king that we see here. Now let's take a look at the story of a second king. So catching up to the story, we know that Jesus, along with his parents, came back to their homeland, but instead of going to the southern part, they decided to go to the northern part of Judea, Galilee, because they heard that Herod the Great's son was ruling in his place. What happened with Herod the Great prior to his death was actually interesting. As we know, he was a very paranoid fella. And a few years prior to his death, he executed 3 of his eldest sons, including his oldest son, who was to be the next king. His oldest son was named Antipater II, named after his grandfather, Antipater the First, who was the father of this dynasty. So again, Antipater II, he was the exclusive successor to the throne. But because his father had such a high level of paranoia, any hint of insatisfaction pertaining to his eldest kids would lead them to make these types of decisions of executing them, because he thought they were trying to kill him, commit treason, and take over the rule of his kingdom prior to his death. And based on these tactics, Augustus Caesar, the Caesar of the Roman Empire, said this, which was somewhat comical: "It is better to be Herod's pig than to be his son." Why did he say it is better to be Herod's pig than to be his son? Well, Herod the Great, even though he was not a purebred Jewish person, he was an Edomite, he still followed the customs of the Jewish people and would not dare eat a pig, so pigs were not harmed during Herod's reign. But if you were a son of Herod, especially a high-ranking son, it was likely that you would be executed in due time. But now we do have this other king. On verse 22 it says, "But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea." So Archelaus was the 4th son in line. But instead of being the exclusive heir to the throne, prior to his death, Herod the Great, he decreed that his kingdom would be divided up between 3 of his remaining sons along with his sister. So essentially the kingdom was divided into 4 parts, and Archelaus, because he was the eldest son of that group, he got a 1/3 or a 1/4 of the kingdom, but it was the bigger part. He essentially got half of the kingdom from Samaria down, which included this area that initially Joseph, Mary, and Jesus wanted to dwell in. They were coming back to this area. But then they found out that Archelaus was the one who was chosen to reign over this area, and they said, uh-oh, we better not stay here. Why? Because it is known how cruel Archelaus is. Archelaus, much like his father, also had a lot of anxieties pertaining to his position. When the Roman emperor obliged, again, Rome was the sovereign. Even though Herod the Great stipulated that his kingdom would be divided between his remaining sons and his sister, Rome had to make the final decision, and they obliged. And they said, okay, we'll go ahead and divide up this kingdom, and we'll give it to your sons, and Archelaus is going to get this particular portion, but we are not going to name him king, which is why the reference of Herod or king is not mentioned here. Archelaus was actually something called an ethnarch, a ruler over a particular ethnic group. So he was there, called an ethnarch. To him, this was a slap in the face, most likely. Here I am. Now I am the eldest son. And I should be the one who rules over my father's kingdom. But instead of that, my younger siblings also get portions of the kingdom along with my aunt, and I'm not even called a king. So it seems like this particular king, Archelaus, and I'm calling him king, air quotation marks here. He was a ruler, a king type ruler. It seems like he wanted to prove his worth. If his father was named Herod the Great, I believe that he wanted to be known as Herod the Greatest. And he wanted the satisfaction of historians looking upon his reign as even greater than his father, even though in the beginning it didn't seem like that would be the case. So he became a very cruel and horrible leader. Why? He was reaching for the lowest hanging fruit. He wanted to be like his father. He actually wanted to be greater than his father. But unfortunately, even though he inherited a portion of the kingdom, he did not inherit his father's political prowess. Herod the Great was a great politician, among other things, which is why he was able to become a type of king, even though Rome was actually ruling over this portion of the world. But Archelaus was not the politician that his father was. But he had to mimic his father somehow. So again, the only thing that he could replicate was the savagery, was the cruelty that he saw his father depicting in his later years. And he thought to himself, most likely, if my father was cruel, man, they have not seen a thing. Historians tell us that his reign was actually very short. He only reigned for about 10 years. He was so cruel to his people to the point where the nobles of the region, they went and complained to the Caesar, and the Caesar finally was fed up because they did not want people revolting against this chosen leader. So they removed him from power, and he perished and died in exile. His remaining years were not noteworthy. He was not even allowed to die in his homeland. And this is the story of the second king. But now, let's also look into the story of a third king. And again, the title is The Three Kings. So it wouldn't make sense for me to end right here. Right? Who is the third king? Obviously, Jesus is the third king. And initially, what I would like to do here is reread verse 6, which was this prophecy that was given to Herod the Great. And it said, and this is a partial quotation of Micah, at least in the beginning, "But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are not the least among the rulers of Judah, For out of you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. The whole context of Micah leads us to believe that this was a prophecy that was given to the people at a time that they needed some type of encouragement. Micah mostly was a prophet of the southern kingdom, Judah. They were about to go into exile. And prior to this historically happening, this event, this prophecy was given as an encouragement that even though their time seemed dark and hope was almost all lost, there would come a time in the future where a ruler would be extracted from this area and he would rule over this whole region and be the epitome of whatever we think of as a mighty king, a heroic king, the King of Kings. So Jesus is our third king. And ironically, if we were to make somewhat of a comparison between Jesus and the other kings that have been mentioned already here, mostly based on these extra biblical accounts, but also including the things that we find in the Bible, we see some similarities. First of all, we know that Herod the Great, he died in utter agony, eaten up by worms from the inside out. This third king, Jesus, he also died in agony. As he was hanging on the cross, not only dealing with the physical pain that he had withstood for hours and then being nailed to the cross, eventually he felt the utter agony of the spiritual pain of being somehow separated from the Father. We don't know how, and we don't know exactly what to make of this, but he uttered the words, "My Father, why have you forsaken me?" Agony. Pure agony. Very similar, again, to Herod the Great. Greater agony, but both dealt with those types of deaths. What else do we find that is similar? Well, we know that Archelaus, he suffered through exile. Only reigned for about 10 years, wanted to be the greatest, but actually became a nobody. Had to flee from his homeland and died in a foreign land. We also know that Jesus, this third king, he also had to bear with exile. If you look through commentaries, it'll vary, but most likely Jesus and his parents, they spent a period of about 1 to 3 years in Egypt and then eventually came back. But not to mention the other type of exile that Jesus experienced, having to leave the heavenly realm to be here amongst us in this earthly realm, choosing to forego temporarily the privileges of his divine nature to deal with this earthly nature and the sin and the fallen world and everything else that is included in this reality. Exile. We also know the historical account here includes the story of a king willing to kill his firstborn child, Herod the Great. And it didn't seem enough because he went down the list. Because if you kill your firstborn child, someone else is the oldest son. Kill him off as well. And then someone else is the oldest son. Kill him off as well. And we also know a story of the King of Kings willing to sacrifice his only begotten son, heir to the throne. But obviously these similarities, these comparisons, they're very superficial. Jesus' agony was completely and totally undeserved. Herod the Great got what was coming to him. I personally believe, and this is total speculation, but God, even though this somehow fulfilled prophecy, had utter disgust for the actions of Herod the Great, to the point where he inflicted such horrible pains upon him, leading to his death. He wanted a quick death. He wanted to take his own life, but not even that did God allow him to experience. He got what was coming to him. But Jesus suffered even more, yet totally undeserved. Isaiah 53 mentions that he was wounded for his transgressions. He was wounded for our transgressions. By his wounds we were healed. Jesus' exile was totally unfair. Again, a little kid, the King of Kings, being born amongst farm animals, and then having to leave his home country and go into a foreign land, not to mention this heavenly exile of putting to the side the privileges of his divine nature to temporarily dwell amongst us in this realm, full of sin, full of decay, full of sadness. Totally unfair. And we also know that his father's willingness to sacrifice him had nothing to do with him being a blinded tyrant filled with paranoia. God knew what he was doing. Before the beginning of time. And that is amazing to even try to wrap it around our head. Before the beginning of time, this plan was already established. To sacrifice his one and only begotten son. Not because he somehow would have been privileged. Not because he had some type of anxiety pertaining to his position. Not because he was fearful somehow of being replaced. But because of love. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. And for whoever should believe in him shall not perish, but have everlasting life. So what are we celebrating here, folks, during Christmas? We're celebrating the privilege of being subjects to a king. But not any type of king. We know that human history has fabricated, has lifted up many rulers, many kings, many leaders, none of which are as good as this king, who we are honored and we are privileged to be subjects of him, which is why we are here in this day and age, still celebrating his birth. Amen? Prior to the last song, I do have a couple more announcements. In our business meeting, we will cover not only the needed budget,